So I get to welcome Chairman Walden. Chairman Walden represents the people of Oregon in the 2nd Congressional District. He's a lifelong Oregonian whose ancestors came to Oregon by wagon train in 1845, according to your bio. Now, being somebody from Nebraska, I always wonder why mine stopped. I'm always like, well, did they not know to go further? So I just want you to know that already I'm envious, okay?
Mine stopped for a while.
So, we've heard a lot about you being a radio operator, and we know that we are very lucky to have you as a chairman while all this is going on, because you're somebody who's had the honor of being regulated by some of the entities that you now have the opportunity to legislate and have opinions on. So we're excited to hear about a few little items we've heard in the news on that. But in all this time in Congress, he has put business and technology experience to work in the Energy and Commerce Committee, and especially as the chairman of the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology. So we're very excited to have you here. I have a couple items of order of business, which I have to do so the people at AEI will be happy. Technology Policy Daily is where you can find our regular information. We have a regular blog there. In this same room, we'll be having an event with Eric Schmidt on March 18th. Is that the same day you guys are having, you have a hearing that day?
The 19th.
Okay, so you can have
However,
a preview.
there will be a hearing going on that day.
So you guys are going to have a full calendar, plan on spending some of it here. And then on April Fool's Day, which just happens to be by date of the calendar, but Maureen O'Hausen, a Federal Trade Commissioner, will be here doing regulatory humility. And she has a wonderful piece that I wish many people in Washington would read, because it actually falls a lot into this area that we're going to talk about today. So Chairman Walden, welcome.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. Thank you for letting me share kind of an outline of where the committee's headed over the next year or two. And so I've got some formal remarks I want to give. We lay it out there. I want to go back to your comment about why your ancestors stopped in Nebraska, however. My father used to talk about how there was a dispute in Oregon about where the end of the Oregon Trail was, and many of us, where I grew up in the Dalles, that was officially the end of it, except then others claimed it was actually more just outside of Portland. My father used to say there was a sign in the Dalles that said end of the Oregon Trail. Those who couldn't read went on to Portland. That's kind of a Oregon east-west thing, Anyway, I want to thank you for letting me share some comments. No discussion of communications policy could ignore the events of the last week. The Commission's most recent actions step well beyond its authority in recasting the internet as a public utility and supplanting the decisions of state and local elected officials whether to invest tax dollars in broadband and the FCC's Central Economic Planning. I am deeply troubled by both decisions at the FCC. So let's start with net neutrality. Last Thursday, as you all know, the FCC voted to adopt rules to reclassify broadband as a telecommunications service and apply Depression-era utility regulation to the vibrant internet economy. This is the latest chapter in a decades-long fight between internet regulation advocates and the free market. Last May, the FCC issued an NPRM at Chairman Wheeler's instruction, seeking input on how to put net neutrality protections into place, relying on Section 706 authority, consistent with the D.C. Circuit's ruling in Verizon v. FCC, the court case that invalidated the FCC's 2010 rules. Despite the chairman's express preference to follow the roadmap laid out by the D.C. Circuit's opinion, sometime between May and early 2015, Chairman Wheeler's tune changed. In the midst of this discussion, I had the opportunity to meet with Chairman Wheeler late last November. I reiterated congressional Republicans' concerns with Title II and with regulating the most successful economic and regulatory experiment in U.S. history. And in that meeting last fall, Chairman Wheeler assured me that he too was committed to net neutrality without reclassification as broadband. This stands in stark contrast to the press reports of Chairman Wheeler's summer epiphany and decision to impose net neutrality through reclassification as a telecommunications service. I would say this action was curiously timed just after President Obama announced his support for Title II regulation. But thanks to an article in the Wall Street Journal and FOIA requests of Vice News, we know that this was far from coincidental. We also know that by late November, Chairman Wheeler was well aware that the White House had already decided the fate of broadband. Taking the Title II path that the President decided upon is a mistake, something that we explored thoroughly in my subcommittee's hearings last Wednesday and one that I truly believe will ultimately harm the Silicon Valley companies who have celebrated it. I believe this is a step backward for U.S. internet policy. Title II will only lead to increased uncertainty, depressed investment, and decreased innovation. As someone who represents a rural district that's still waiting for a robust and widespread broadband coverage, any disincentive to greater broadband build-out is extremely troubling. I can't stress enough the damage I believe that Title II approach will have on our country's broadband speed and deployment. This may truly be the end of the internet as we know and love it if these rules withstand a court challenge, which I don't think they will. In large part due to these grave concerns about FCC overreach, Chairman Upton, Chairman Thune, and I have worked together to draft legislation that would put into law the protections that have net neutrality proponents that they have sought for years without the caustic, investment-killing uncertainty of Title II. The bill prohibits blocking, it prohibits throttling and paid prioritization, and it requires that ISPs be transparent in their network management practices and prices. We cover both fixed and mobile broadband with our draft legislation, and we provide enforcement mechanisms that allow the FCC to address complaints from consumers as well as raise investigations of its own. In conjunction with our first net neutrality hearing this year, we released the draft that aimed to thread the needle by protecting consumers without unnecessarily harming our broadband economy. The draft legislation was crafted in large part by drawing on net neutrality proposals from Democrats both on the Hill and at the Commission, ranging from former FCC Chairman Janikowski to former Energy and Commerce Ranking Member Henry Waxman. Given Democrats' longstanding support for this language, I hope they can now engage with us. We have reached out repeatedly to members and staff in an attempt to, at the very least, begin a dialogue on the potential for compromise. But to date, our efforts have gone unanswered. I'm at a loss for how to make my plea any clearer to my colleagues. Please work with us to draft a bill. What the FCC did last week is ill-advised, illogical, and illegal. And while there are other tools at Congress's disposal to express our displeasure with the FCC's action, I remain firmly committed to a bipartisan legislative solution. We've done a great deal of outreach to ISPs, edge providers, public interest groups, and many, many others on ways to improve our bill, and we will continue to do that. All along, we've been open-minded about the appropriate way to codify these rules, and we have made a genuine and sincere effort at compromise that is palatable to both sides of the aisle. There's no question that this is the role of Congress. It is the role Congress is meant to play, crafting narrow legislation that achieves policy goals with certainty and stability. While we may disagree on the exact contours of good net neutrality policy, there are few people who argue that the uncertainty arising from protracted litigation benefits anyone except perhaps the lawyers. The legislation we put forward gives consumers the protections they deserve, industry the certainty it needs, and puts an end to the legal gymnastics taking place at the FCC as they again attempt to shoehorn the policy they want into statutory authority they actually have. Forcing modern technology into decades-old regulatory schemes is unacceptable and is in some ways a symptom of a much larger weakness at the FCC. The FCC has a clear problem with an outdated statute, outmoded agency processes, and an agency culture that eschews independence and expert analysis in favor of clickbait-driven comment filing and White House fiat. As many of you know, in December of 2013, Chairman Fred Upton and I began a multi-year process to gather information on how to update the Communications Act to reflect the modern communications marketplace. To that end, committee staff have issued 6 white papers, reviewed thousands of pages of responses, and taken countless meetings with interested parties. The response was impressive. The suggestions for improvement were many. And after more than a year's work on this issue, we've reached one escapable conclusion. You cannot reform regulation without reforming the regulator. For too long, the FCC has been left to its own devices. This has resulted in sloppy bookkeeping, shoddy process, and a complete abandonment of the notion of independence. That's why for the first part of the Communications Act update legislative process, we will undertake to reauthorize the Federal Communications Commission. Put simply, we'll start with Title I. If we're going to put modern laws into place, there must be a modern agency to implement them. It's been 24 years since the FCC was last reauthorized by the United States Congress. When you think of the almost uncountable ways the communications and technology industries have changed, how can the agency still be reliant on a budget and an authorization that was passed before the advent of smartphones or the rise of the commercial internet? My subcommittee spent a great deal of time over the past 15 months examining the ways in which the Communications Act needs to be updated. One of the most common themes noted by commenters in the problem of the agency that implements the laws. The FCC is a child of Congress, and it is high time that we return to the good government practice of having the authorizing committee take a hard look at the agency before Congress hands over another appropriation. Let me tell you a little about the magnitude by which the FCC's budget has changed over the past 24 years. Their requested 2016 auction budget is larger than the entire FCC budget was when we last reauthorized the agency. Now, obviously, there are many factors that contribute to this growth at the FCC, and some increase over that time period is expected. I share this fact primarily to illustrate just how drastically the world of the agency has transformed since the 1990 reauthorization legislation was passed. It's time for a reauthorization process. Throughout my time as chairman of the subcommittee, I've made it a priority to do everything we could to improve the FCC and hold the agency accountable for its actions, its processes, and its spending and management. In the 113th Congress alone, we talked to the managing director and the inspector general about the agency's budget and management. We brought all 5 commissioners up more than once to talk about a wide range of policy issues, from net neutrality to spectrum auctions. We talked about media ownership and more. We talked to bureau chiefs about their regulatory agendas and spoke with countless outside experts about rules proposed and put forward by the agency. On Wednesday of this week, the managing director of the agency will again testify before us to answer questions about a number of issues of which we're concerned. And then in 2 weeks, all 5 FCC commissioners will appear before the subcommittee. Each of these hearings has raised matters that either the FCC needed to address or that the Congress needed to legislate. The extensive examination of the FCC has only reaffirmed to me that there's more work to be done. Every year, the FCC is appropriated a great deal of money. That money ultimately comes from the U.S. communications consumers, and it's essential that we hold the Commission accountable for the money they extract from the American public. By returning to periodic reauthorization to the Federal Communications Commission, the committee will be able to ensure the money is being used in the most effective and efficient way possible and that resources are being utilized appropriately. This is our congressional responsibility. It is our job to do this due diligence, and we will. Moreover, regular reauthorizations lend integrity to the work of the agency and provide the public with confidence in their government that is so often lacking. Now, in addition to concerns with the Commission's spending, we've devoted many hearings and several pieces of legislation to improving the processes at the Federal Communications Commission, an issue I have long felt strongly about, likely due in no part to my own experiences as an FCC licensee. I believe that good laws come from good process, and the transparency and accountability are what we all owe those whom we govern. These principles have driven my work as chairman of the subcommittee, and I expect the FCC to do no less. Unfortunately, even with the appointment of a special counsel on process reform at the FCC, we've continued to see evidence of major process failures. These failures have reached such a serious extent that I joined Chairman Upton and Oversight Chairman Tim Murphy in opening an investigation into commission process failures. These developments only serve to confirm my suspicion that the FCC's operations are in serious need of thoughtful evaluation. One process ripe for the reform is the FCC's lack of formalized cost-benefit analysis before the adoption of regulations. This is something I've been pushing for since my earliest drafts of process reform legislation. And it's a concept that has support in 2011 in the presidential memorandum. The president himself has supported these concepts. Unfortunately, while the president saw fit to eviscerate the FCC's independence when it suited his preferred policy outcome, the memorandum applying fiscal responsibility and rulemaking did not apply to independent agencies. How ironic. However, the idea is a good one, should be embraced whenever new regulations are considered, regardless of the agency's organic structure. By looking at consumer harm and conducting economic, market, and cost-benefit analyses, the agency will better address the needs of consumers it protects and reflect the reality of the industry it regulates, particularly small businesses that may be disproportionately affected. Now, one would imagine that the FCC system, like other federal agencies and departments, would include a check on the commission itself in the form of an inspector general. Now, while the FCC does have an IG, a major dysfunction within the agency structure has long been of concern to me, and that is the lack of independence in the independent inspector general. The FCC's inspector general, you see, is somewhat unique in that, unlike most IGs, he or she is not confirmed by the United States Senate, and in fact serves at the pleasure of the chairman. It's hard to imagine that the fact that he or she could be fired by the chairman doesn't somehow affect the IG's decision-making process. Anything that calls into question the integrity and independence of an IG is harmful to the agency and to the good government practices we seek, regardless of the validity of those concerns. There should be no question as to whether the IG is able to make an independent evaluation of agency action or initiate an investigation when needed, without fear of retribution or intimidation from the chairman. Having an independent watchdog improves the agency's credibility, increases public confidence, and reduces opportunity for mischief at all levels. I'm not aiming at any specific action or any particular IG. In fact, Mr. Hunt seems by all accounts to be an honest, capable, and humble public servant. Rather, I'm looking to remedy a deeply rooted flaw in the actual design of the agency. While reauthorization is a helpful tool for keeping any agency on track, it lends itself particularly well to the FCC, an agency tasked with regulating an ever-evolving industry. By periodically reviewing the utility of regulations, the agency is forced to take a hard look at their operations and management and determine whether they're doing the best job for both the industry they regulate and the consumers that they protect. Think of it as a yearly review. Many employees are required to take a look at their progress and performance over that period of a year and delineate their goals for the upcoming year. Some of us have a biennial review. Every 2 years, our constituents get to review what we've done. Typically, in an annual review, you get to consult with your superiors, your employers, who provide constructive criticism. Applying this same practice, the FCC will allow for a candid assessment of things the agency is doing well, areas where they need improvement, or where they should change. Now, the goal of reauthorization is not to tie the hands of the FCC, and it surely is not to create uncertainty over those regulated by the agency. Instead, we hope to start a useful and productive dialogue about the state of the Commission, which they need us to do to make their jobs easier, and what Congress needs the agency to do in order to continue meeting its statutory mandates. This exercise can and should be beneficial to all involved parties. And we continue down our path to modernizing the laws governing the communications sector. It only makes sense to begin with the agency at the heart of implementing and enforcing those laws. But the COM Act update's a complicated and massive undertaking, and while we are starting with the Commission itself, our legislative work to update the Communications Act is just beginning. Whether it's the fictions forced by a statute born of single-user networks, market assumptions that discount or completely ignore the existence of the internet, or the regulatory vestiges of a world where Ma Bell ran a monopoly, we must make the changes needed to bring the Communications Act and the Commission itself into the 21st century. Thank you again for the invitation to be with you today, share these formal remarks with you, and now I turn it back over to Shane. Thank you very much.
Wow. Sounds like you've put a lot of thought into that.
We have a lot of issues before the subcommittee.
Right. So I always say I don't want to look back in 2020 and be like, remember when the internet was cool? And something really horrible happened between now and then, and I worry that that might have happened last week. I think one of the major questions that we all have, especially just hearing what you just had to say, is do you think in 2020 we're still going to be litigating over this, or you can talk some of your colleagues into some common sense ideas on how to put things back on track?
Yes, and I hope. So yes, in the sense that the FCC is moving forward with their rules. When we get to see them is anybody's guess. My understanding, if I remember right, in the 2010 order, it took about 10 months before we actually saw the rules. A couple of years, I think 3.5 years in litigation, and the FCC got slapped down. It didn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be that way this time. I'm hopeful now that the commission has acted that Democrats will have their shock collars turned off and they'll actually be able to cross the line and work with us. I say it that way because it's been a great frustration to put forward legislation that my colleagues on my side of the aisle, many of whom don't believe we even need to legislate in this space, but are willing to prevent the bad behavior people don't want to see happen in the future, throttling, blocking, all that sort of thing. We've come so far on our side to bring legal certainty and not upend the internet with utility-style monopoly regulation. And yet not a single member of the other side of the aisle was free to engage with us legislatively. Hopefully now, because we heard they couldn't until after the vote, hopefully now they can. And so we're keeping that door open. And I think that is the best way to move forward. Absent that, we had witnesses talk about what's happened in Europe in terms of their investment and build out versus us, their regulatory scheme versus ours. And I'd rather be us than them. And we're just about to be them. In fact, isn't it ironic that Chairman Wheeler puts us under utility-style European regulation and then flees the country to Europe? I mean, where he is today. I'm just saying.
Valid. So staying domestic for a second, 'cause it's easy. I have a lot of things to say on the international front. I think 6 pages actually was very nice of you. I think your colleagues can get through that. Bill. Yes, versus 322 pages, I imagine not a lot of your colleagues will be able to get through. Are they asking a lot of questions, or are they just sort of going along with the party line? You mentioned the shock collar. Are you getting people pulling you aside and saying, okay, can you really explain this to me?
Not yet.
Are you hopeful that might happen?
I'm always hopeful.
Okay.
But not yet. Now remember, there are only 5 appointed officials and their staff, allegedly, who have seen this. Maybe a few folks at the White House, well, probably write it, but there are very few people that have seen the 317 pages, I think. Well, we don't even know how many.
Who's already missing pages?
well, we don't know who's on which page.
Okay.
But remember now, so you have 3 people in America, none of whom are accountable to any voters and are supposed to be independent, have just decided on their own that the internet needs to be dealt with like it was a failed monopoly. And I find that really troubling. And the fact that 4 million Americans weighed in, and everybody's got an opinion on what the FCC did, but very few people have ever read the order because it's not publicly available and won't be available until the lawyers now on both sides go back and forth. The majority side will try and buttress the court case in there as they tweak the order, and then the 2 Republican commissioners' attorneys will try and come back, and that'll go back and forth for a while until they all get exhausted and lay down their pens. And then it will go to court. That's a pretty crummy way to do process. It's a pretty crummy way to take over the internet here in Washington, but it is a classic Washington top-down regulatory overreach.
Going to the international front, I feel like we're giving the world very confusing messages. We're for the free and open internet globally. And I'm not sure that we just sent the same message on a domestic point of view. I mean, you mentioned that the chairman's over at the Mobile World Congress. Any thoughts on that? Do you talk to the people internationally who are looking at this issue?
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't think it makes our case at the ITU any stronger by saying actually it is a utility, which is what they've done by making it a Title II common carrier. So I don't know how that somehow strengthens our hand to keep governments out of controlling the management of the internet. You saw a report just over the weekend with that assassination in Moscow, that for a while the Russian government shut down some flow of information about that. I mean, they're already kind of controlling content, and I'm not suggesting that this FCC is going to control content, but you do have to wonder at some point when they're going to forbear against how many of 1,000 different rules within the CFRs. Which are they? Which aren't they? How's that going to play out? Who's advantaged? Who isn't? Which can sustain court challenge? Which can't? I mean, this is a classic sort of too much government in a very vibrant marketplace scenario. So I worry about it.
You mentioned in an earlier interview that you had concerns about the Federal Trade Commission possibly being kind of written out in this order as well.
Well, not possibly, they are written out because they do not have jurisdiction over common carrier utilities by statute. So now where you had the Federal Trade Commission able to weigh in, and they will be weighing in on cell phones, however, soon. Just kidding about the ring. Where they were able to weigh in where there are market abuses, their powers are now gone. Now they will seek to get them back. This is, after all, how Washington works among regulators, because remember, what are they paid to do? Regulate. Nobody wants to give up power. So you already have the head of the FTC saying, oh, well, just because they're a common carrier at the internet, that's not good. We need to have a piece of this space too. Does all this extra regulation help grow the internet? And I think the answer is no. Did they prove actual market failure that should take us to the most comprehensive and restrictive government regulation known to humankind? No, they didn't do that. Or were there some abuses? Yes. Did they get dealt with? Yes. Are some of them a decade old and one-time occurrence? Yes. There was no market failure here. There were a lot of political pressures at bay. And then I think you have to go to the next level, which is if the issue is about blocking the flow of content, paid prioritization of content, throttling of content, is today's information society and sharing simply about the fibers and the wires? Or is it about what carries the flow of information over those fibers and wire? There's an interesting article in Forbes recently about Google's enormous tentacles across the internet and in the ad space and their ability to sort of control it from one end to the other, about prioritization, paid prioritization, about blocking, about throttling. And I think in an internet information world, we have to realize in this century, it's not just about who controls the wires, but who controls what goes over those wires. And so these information companies we know about that are fabulous and have great business models and probably more cash in the bank than the U.S. government, what role for them?
I also have concerns about cybersecurity because one of the things that we ask all these companies to do is keep everything as current as possible as we continue to go on the chase on how do we keep things as safe and secure. But part of the challenge is you don't know what the little zeros and ones are all the time when they're going across. So you need large bandwidth. You need to keep building out. I think about it as like the House of Windsor. You just keep building rooms, and because we're not exactly sure, how much of this is negative traffic. 85% of email traffic is supposed to be spam, and that's not actually in the United States. So you need huge bandwidth to do that. So I guess one of my concerns is the continued investment that we expect these companies to make.
And there's a story in the Wall Street Journal today, I think is when I read it, about the overseas investment in different regulatory structures and what works and what doesn't. And the point of one of the people interviewed in the article was precisely that. If you put too much downward pressure on those who lay the fiber and run the networks, they will stop doing that and move to do something else, or they won't invest as heavily. And the problem we have is making the case for what didn't happen. It's hard to prove a negative. But I think intellectually and in our hearings, we've had economic or witnesses, economists that have said if you do too much of this regulation of the backbone, there will be less investment in it. And for us to keep pace in America, we should be doing everything we can to clear the obstacles. That's the whole theory behind 706, not to dumb it down and regulate it out of existence, which it won't. There will still be an internet. There's still money in it. I get that. But will it be as vibrantly built out as it otherwise would be? I don't think anybody can make the argument that American investors have not invested in building out the internet. They have. Better than anywhere in the world. Our penetration rates are higher. Our mobility rates are higher. And I just trying to find what was broken here that would lead you to have the government in Washington, D.C. take over the control of the internet. And just because Tom Wheeler and his two colleagues say we won't use these other statutory provisions, we will forbear, and whether they can actually do that or not is an open question. What about the next commission, and the one after that, and the one after that? And that's what I think is a problem going forward. My guess is this commission will be very careful how far they lean into Washington regulation. I have never seen in all my years where an agency, given power it hasn't used, doesn't eventually migrate to use the power it hasn't used. There are forces out there, pretty well-funded, strong, competent, capable forces that will always put pressure on to use authority agencies haven't used.
We're going to open up for questions. Mr. Beaver, we've got a first question back here.
Hi, Mr. Walden. Todd Shields, Bloomberg News. Good afternoon.
Todd, good to see you again.
Good to see you. Given that the words Title II came out of President Obama's mouth on November 10, does your bill keep the FCC from using Title II powers completely? And if so, what hope to have any Democrats sign on? You're asking them to go against the president.
No, I'm asking them to go for a vibrant internet economy that's not overregulated by Washington. But yes, I know that's going to be a lift. But again, I believe that, first of all, the issues that we've been told are the consumer problems we take care of in our 6-page draft. Throttling, prioritization, blocking, transparency, all of that is spelled out, and there is full enforcement authority to enforce all those provisions. Full enforcement authority. So the FCC can do everything to stop bad behavior and bring greater transparency to network management under our legislation. We just don't think the FCC should move to regulate it like it were a monopoly, because I don't think it is. And for small internet service providers, you're starting to hear from them just a bit, including some in my district that say, whoa, I'm just a little guy here. I'm going to have to hire attorneys. I'm going to have to figure out all this new set of regulations coming in. So the irony of where this administration, in almost every case, in this specific case, is you're going to continue to pyramid up, not expand out, and just drive them into fewer providers with greater government dictates. And I'm just not in that philosophical camp that that's the best way to work. And by the way, the internet has come about as the biggest economic engine and change in our lifetime. And they didn't have to come to Washington and get permission. And the day that the app community recognizes they're not far off from having to get permission is the day then maybe Silicon Valley will say, whoa, wait a minute. And the day that Google and Yahoo and Facebook and others realize if throttling and prioritization and all that is to be regulated as a common carrier issue under Title II, how do they get away with throttling, paid prioritization, and blocking? And they do. They do. They're the off-ramps. And so in an information sharing age, they are bringing this on themselves.
Next question. JC, you got over.
Yep, there we go.
Chairman, good afternoon. Do you have an opinion on the...
I'm sorry, could you identify yourself just so we have it on record?
Oh, sure.
Thanks.
David Hatch, Policy and Regulatory Report.
Thank you.
Do you have an opinion on the Comcast-Time Warner cable deal? Do you think it would be beneficial to the marketplace, or do you think it would have negative consequences for consumers and competition?
I will tell you I have stayed out of that discussion to let the expert agencies do their job, as I have on the other mergers. And I think we have at the FTC the full authority to look out and see what's best for consumers, and the FCC will play its role as well. So actually I have stayed out of that, and even today will continue to.
Another question back here. We've got one up front too.
Rudy Tackles, CNS News. Why are Democrats so persistent on regulating it as Title II instead of through Section 706 or congressional action or what have you? Why are they so persistent on doing that? Is there another motive or is there an end game to it?
I wish I had a good answer for you. It's probably best that I not try to speak for them. I sometimes have enough trouble speaking for my own side of the aisle. I don't know. Look, there is a huge groundswell, more on the left, for Title II regulation of the internet. There just is. I mean, that's where you have 4 million comments coming in and all that. It is a mantra. It is real. It is there. I know it. I mean, I hear from people who aren't happy with my position. And so I can only imagine, since it's more on the Democrat side than the Republican side, because we're more free market, they have to respond to that. I get that. I just think they're going too far with Title II. And I don't think always people understand what they're for when you get into the weeds and the nuances of a Title II versus a 706 versus can you do that under 332 to 3 whatever the mobile is. They don't know that. They just want to know that they're not going to be treated unfairly by some big communications company. And I'm with it. We can do that. And that's why I've tried to keep the door open on legislation. I could have done a markup. I could have crammed through a Republican-only bill and all that. But I know the outcome would not be what we want. So I hope once this order's out there that people will go, okay, maybe there is a better way. And we give you certainty. We avoid the litigation. I know the communications bar won't be happy with me, but we can get certainty. So I don't know why they don't.
Sorry, up front here. Very patient.
Hi, Mr. Chairman. Good to see you again. Bill Signer with the Alarm Industry.
Yep.
We like what you've done. We like the fact that there's going to be legislation. We're very concerned. We want access. We want to be able to provide our services. The concern we have is that neither your bill nor what the FCC has done really addresses our concerns. And our concerns are basically that if they are competing with us, that we have equal access under equal terms, and that they can't cross-subsidize and they can't use our customer lists. So we would like to work with you on crafting that. We've talked to Dave and with Ray, and
Right.
we're looking forward to doing that. So
Thank you.
thank you.
Yeah. And those are the issues, best in the COM Act update, where we can get deep in and say, okay, what are the puts and takes here and where are the abuses? So thanks, Bill.
Another question I heard on sorry, go ahead.
She had one right there.
Yeah.
Hi, Chairman. Katie McAuliffe with Americans for Tax Reform. I wanted to ask you about how this will affect taxes and fees. So there's been a lot of discussion that taxes and fees won't go up, at least at the federal level, when we talk about universal service, but the state level, you've got the opportunity for communications type taxes, property taxes, things along those lines, universal service fees.
Mm-hmm. You do, and there's a dispute, as you know, over what will be forbeared against, what won't, who has what authority. The interesting thing is if you apply, as my understanding, if you apply the USF fees to the internet, your landline and mobile charges will go down, your internet fees will go up. So there will be some shifting of that burden. As people cut their landlines and go to all mobile or VoIP or something, we probably have to figure out how do you maintain universal access to phone coverage throughout the country. District like mine, bigger than a state this side of the Mississippi, you wouldn't have phone service. You wouldn't even have electric service if we hadn't somehow socialized it. I mean, it just is the way it is in the very rural parts of there's no economic model that works in some of these areas where I got 3 counties where there's 1 person for every 9 miles of phone line. Or power line in this case. So there isn't an economic model, and I think as Americans we want to be able to have connection because when you're out there and you hit a deer and you're in trouble, you want that cell phone to work and know where you are when you call 911. So we got to figure out how do you socialize, but there's also room, I think, to have some sort of cap on those funds so they're not just a resource that can always be tapped at unlimited amount to fund whatever project somebody at the FCC comes up with. That's the debate. And then there are these other questions about the depth to which local governments and state public utility commissions and all can go to assess fees and taxes. They've kind of blown past that in the discussion at the FCC. It's something we're going to take a close look at.
A question over here. Sorry.
Hi, Olivia Marcus with Medill News Service. You mentioned the FCC budget. Could you just elaborate a bit on what your future plans are for that?
Well, not at this point. We will have a hearing, as I say, with the CFO to get into the budget. But when I was in the state legislature, this was common practice. Now, we didn't have authorizers and appropriators. We just had the equivalent of appropriators. But we looked at agency budgets. We looked at literally, now I'm going to show my age, the green bar printouts of every line item they spent. That was part of our due diligence. Now, this is an agency that is going to have to move out of its current pretty fancy digs at the portals and needs 40 or some $1 million to go move somewhere else. Well, how'd that number come about? What do they really need? Where should they be located? We've got some spare retail empty space in my district that might work. Might be a little inconvenient, but we'll have better broadband connection in the end. So there are lots of just the nuts and bolts of agency budgeting. It hasn't been done since 1990, and I think it's overdue. It's our responsibility. By the way, I advocate this for every agency in the government. It's just this is one I have jurisdiction over in my subcommittee. The authorizers, those of us not on Appropriations Committee, need to do our jobs, and I intend to do my job here.
That is going to be our last question. Please join me in thanking the chairman for enlightening us
Thank
today, and we look forward to all the work that you're going to put towards us.